Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya. Good morning, Adefemi. 4 a.m. in New York, I guess.
It is. Good morning, Dr. Rubin. Good morning, Ayo. Good morning, Rafai. Let me give you the exact time. It is 3:31 a.m. in New York just now, Dr. Rubin. So yes, very, very early in the morning. But as you can tell, I'm always excited to hear your voices, always excited to tell you about what's happening around the world. So let's start our world brief. Of course, we are stood outside the United Nations headquarters here in New York, and that's where we're going to start our world brief today. Firstly, looking at the comments made at the general debate by Nigerian Vice President Kashim Shettima. He, first of all, took the stage and spoke about how Nigeria had been able to celebrate 25 years, a quarter of a century of unbroken democracy, consecutive years of democracy. And of course, as we know, this is happening against the backdrop of a West Africa region just now struggling with different tenets and different qualities of democracy, most notably in different regions such as Niger and Mali and all of these other issues and countries that have been struggling with military coups and the presence now of a more militarized government structure as opposed to people-led democracy. So that's where he started his comments on. But then he did also go on to talk about different aspects of Nigeria's identity and economy. But before we get into that, he also touched on one of the biggest stories that is happening around the world, the conflict that we're seeing in the Middle East. Here's what he had to say. Let's take a listen.
We are all witnesses to the heart-wrenching situation in Gaza and other Palestinian territories. We cannot discuss war and peace, conflicts and resolution, or humanitarian imperatives today without reflecting on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has been raging since 7th August last year. Of course, the conflict predates this period and has been simmering for a better part of half a century. What it tells us is that the international community has failed to live up to the spirit and aspirations of the United Nations to rid the world of inequality, violence, and domination of one people by another. Justice is antithetical to revenge. Freedom is an inalienable right and a natural entitlement that cannot be denied to any people. The Palestinian people deserve their independence. They deserve to have a home of their own in territories already recognized by this very assembly and by international law, which is being routinely ignored. Nigeria continues to urge efforts to bring back on track the two-state solution that offers the prospect for a new beginning for the region.
All righty, but we had heard what he had to say there, and it's not often that we get to hear the top tiers of Nigeria's government talking about international issues like this. So again, very interesting to see and to listen to what the Vice President had to say as it pertains to Israel and their continuing bombardment across the Middle East just there. We do know that escalating tensions continue to be on the agenda at UNGA just now, and we will get into that a bit more. But staying with the Vice President, he then went on to talk about finance. He talked about how there needs to be a reform of international financial architecture. He talked about how the proceeds of illicit activities of corruption constitute such a significant amount of money that would be hugely valuable to developing countries and the economies therein. So it talks about how there needs to be a seemingly different type of consciousness when it comes to handling these types of monies and the benefits, the positive sides that could be attributed from this illicit activity. Staying on the theme of finance, the Vice President, who also comes from a financial background, talked about the need to reassess debt burdens across the global south. Specifically now, of course, looking at the Nigerian example, he talks about how it is definitely a very heavy constraint on the country's coffers, on the country's economy, and there needs to be some form of a real life conversation about how, if the United Nations is truly keeping its word when it comes to international development, well, that's something that needs to be discussed. And another thing that needs to be discussed, which was echoed by many different African leaders when they took to the podium, and they have been taken to the podium this week, is a reform, an overhaul of the United Nations Security Council. There have been consistent calls from Nigeria, from South Africa, and also from Ghana about there being a need to have a permanent seat at the table when it comes to discussing the UN Security Council. Now, a few days ago, we were discussing how Kenya is deploying hundreds more police officers to Haiti because it's trying to establish a United Nations peacekeeping mission, but it will only be able to do that if the UN Security Council approves, so once they convene at the end of the month. And that's a conversation that directly involves Africa, but doesn't actually have Africa participating in a permanent instance. So he also, the Vice President, discussed that. Moving on now to different issues that are happening on the sidelines of UNGA. Yesterday, Wednesday, was the first day of the Global Africa Business Initiative's event called Unstoppable Africa. And what you had is, over the course of 2 days, high-level discussions being made, side conversations being had, deals being done about how, across different spectrums of life on the African continent, needs to be focused on things like trade, digital innovation, climate as well, all being discussed at Unstoppable Africa Day 1. On stage, you did have the Deputy Director General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, who also did have a few very, very quick words for me as she walked onto stage, and we're hoping that we're able to speak to her one-on-one at some point this week. But also we did see the presence of Aliko Dangote, who took to the stage and had a one-on-one with the moderator, again talking about entrepreneurship, financial capital, Nigeria's potential, Africa's potential when it comes to the areas of business and finance. And then also we were able to speak to the president of Afreximbank, Benedict Orama. He participated in a panel, and on the sidelines of that, he talked about what he usually talks about was his excitement for Africa, and not only looking at Africa as a place that has potential, but already a place that is materializing on its potential and positioning itself to be a leader in this world. There was also conversations about the importance of energy and access to energy from Dr. Akinwumi Adesina of the African Development Bank. So a lot of conversations happening on day 1 at Unstoppable Africa, and it will continue on today. If we take a step away from the United Nations, though, and look at other stories happening around the world, Israel is dominating, as I said, discourse at UNGA. It has continued to do so. Just a few days ago, we talked about how they had deployed airstrikes on Lebanon and killed nearly 500 people. I do think we need to reiterate, 500 people died. That is the single most deadliest attack. And this is happening, ironically, as world leaders are gathering here at the United Nations General Assembly, and the Security Council too are having meetings, ironically called how to promote and maintain international peace. And clearly the international peace is very hard to find when we are seeing what is happening. The Israel is represented here, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, but also Israel's ambassador to the United Nations came out on Wednesday, spoke to journalists, and again reiterated their country's positioning and talked about how Israel is going to continue to defend itself. But I think what was very interesting is that he was asked questions about whether or not Israel is listening to the rest of the world. Are you listening to the United States, one of your closest allies? Are they telling you that you need to pull back? Why aren't you doing so? Where is the defense you're talking about if you are the one perpetuating these deadly attacks? Let us not forget what happened just last week with this simultaneous pager attack. So I do think that what we need to do now with the United Nations, in order for it to maintain its relevance, is to really put some pressure on these international leaders and say to the likes of the United Kingdom and the likes of the United States, if you press the right buttons, you can influence a ceasefire. You can push Israel and Hezbollah away from war. We are hearing that Israel is preparing for a ground invasion in Lebanon that is massive, and it's going to be doing so with the support, the weaponry from the United States and the United Kingdom. They can turn the tap off if they are truly serious about avoiding a war. So we will be keeping our eyes on those establishments happening. And then lastly, some very interesting news coming out of right here in New York. And the mayor of New York is believed to have been indicted following federal investigation into campaign financing and fraud. attached to his own campaign to become mayor. So he has come out to say that he is expecting that he will be indicted. He spoke in a video call and delivered this message and said that he is innocent and will continue to fight the charges and will stay in office while he continues to do so. So if anyone was expecting him to step down or perhaps step away from his duties as he focuses on this federal crime, this indictment allegation, he says he's not going to do so and he will continue to stay mayor for as long as he can.
Okay. Oh, okay. So we're going straight to it. A couple of things yesterday as regards what the Vice President of Nigeria said. I mean, touched on a couple of points. Yes, we are indeed happy, that we've had about 25 years of unbroken democracy, but our politicians too must also make the essence of democracy count for its citizens. And that's the mismatch, and that's the big disconnect. And he also sounded off on the Israel, issue. I thought Nigeria used to take a very big non-aligned stand, but pretty much the point was reiterating the rights of the Palestinian people to be able to exist side by side. But I think the real star of the show, when it comes to speeches yesterday, was Javier Milei of Argentina, where he pretty much he tore the rule book of the United Nations, and he says, you guys are just, socialist bureaucrats, and all the ideas and the pledge you have, the future pledge you have, it's not going to tip the scale. It's not going to change the course of humanity and poverty. And he talked about the unfairness, really, between those rich nations and those poor nations. And to a large extent, yes, I know the French will say to a bavard. I mean, Milei can talk too much sometimes, but he hit the right notes. You see, the insincerity of the West towards us here is the real reason for poverty in the world. And we can't deny the fact. And no matter how much aid that is pumped into the African continent, yes, it's going to move the needle, but it's not going to bring about that economic freedom until Africa takes the bull by the horn by itself, and it doesn't see itself as just a place where you produce natural resource for the West to be able to service their industries, then we're not going to go further. And that's what pretty much Milei was saying. But I don't agree with him on some score. You need some level of socialism to be able to make it trickle down across the classes that really need that wealth. And that's what socialism. So I don't totally discard socialism. I know Milei is a very trumped up, free market capitalist, but it doesn't entirely work. And I've read all the arguments. I've read, from Das Kapital to, the Capitalism Bible and all of that. You need some element of socialism to be able to build about that buffer for welfare states. But also you need justice, social justice.
100%.
And he quoted Thomas Paine, for good measure at the end of it, that you need to keep defending the freedoms. It's not just about believing in it.
All right. Thank you so much for that robust report from UNGA, Adefemi, and of course, just touching on other stories. But let me talk about Africa potentially getting 2 seats on the UN Security Council. That's big, and that's a conversation that's happened a number of times, not just pushed by the Vice President representing the President or speaking on behalf of the President of Nigeria, but also by other countries, including Ghana, South Africa. Recall that 2 years ago, or then President Joe Biden had said that the US would support 2 additional permanent seats on the council to have Africans represent and other countries, for instance, the Latin American countries at the moment. The UN Security Council was set up in 1945. Currently has members including the United States of America, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. Now, the power of the permanent members is that they have veto power, but this veto power is said not to be included in the package for the 2 African seats being considered. And then you wonder if it is, fairness, equity, as the Vice President had talked about multilateralism as well as part of his speech. This thing around Africa being good enough for its numbers, currently with regards to voting in the National Assembly, because of the size of the continent, we have, quite significant influence. But when it comes to making significant decisions around security, we don't have a seat on the table. Now, of course, there are a few things around that some people might think, okay, are we able to afford to sit on that council? Because it involves, for any country or any member country on that, significant investment in financial commitment and personnel-based resource. Perhaps for personnel, not really, but in terms of finances, how much we'll be able to commit to that Security Council would then come under conversation. But the truth is that I don't even think in 2024 we should be having conversations as to whether or not to have Africa have a seat at the table. You know what they say about you pulling up a chair sometimes? I hope that the African leaders who are represented there will stand firm in their resolve to ensure that they leave hunger 79 with a seat at the table. But very importantly, it's how to then select the two countries. It's obvious. I mean, if you wanted to be fair, and if we're not divided along the lines of, okay, who's going to sit? Nigeria, South Africa are big players in that regard. Nigeria already has been involved in peacekeeping missions across the African continent on many levels, and so deservedly should have a seat on the table. But still a lot of conversations around that, but I'm hoping that one of the biggest takeaways for Nigeria and the rest of Africa is to have those two permanent seats at the UN Security Council.
Okay, I commented at length yesterday on Nigeria's national statement that the UNGA delivered on behalf of President Tinubu by Vice President Shettima. I do not intend to repeat myself. I already outlined all those issues yesterday. Only to add, in terms of clarification, that Nigeria's position in terms of the relationship between Israel and Palestine is a two-state solution. And it is in that regard that I imagine that the Nigerian national statement was defending the rights of the people of Palestine and peace in the Middle East. And Nigeria has been consistent in that regard, two-state solution. Let me talk very quickly and briefly about the developments between Israel and Hamas. Yesterday, about 81 persons were killed, over 400 people were displaced. In total, over 90,000 persons have been displaced in this back and forth, hour-on-hour conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, to be specific. And Hezbollah says, well, we're going to go all the way. The Iranian Ayatollah Khamenei says, look, nobody can wipe out Hezbollah. The concern of the international community is to prevent an escalation, to see how peace can be sustained. And it's in this regard that the US and 10 allies, including Australia, Canada, the European Union, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, have been saying, look, they are working towards a 21-day ceasefire. And the UN Secretary General is saying, look, everybody should pull back from the brink. But will diplomacy triumph? Because they're saying there's a diplomatic solution in this regard. As for Eric Adams, it's unfortunate. This was a man who came to power as mayor of the largest city in New York, and now he's been humiliated. He's been indicted. He may not be charged. He says, no, I'm not stepping down, I'm stepping up, and he's denying, any wrongdoing. But we know that in the last 1 year, his electronic devices were collected, his officials were also investigated, including, warrants, search warrants, and all of that. But it's early in the day to make any conclusions. But the lesson is about rule of law. Nobody is above the law in civilized societies, and they can be investigated and be seen to be investigated. But we'll see, we should not indict him if the charges are filed. Thank you.
Agreed. We will see and keep our eyes very much open on what is happening here in New York with Mayor Eric Adams. Let's move on to some newspapers now. And of course, as we look at newspapers across the world, we'll start in Nigeria with the cover of This Day. And This Day takes a look at a host of different stories. But let's start with them looking at essentially the confirmation of Honorable Justice Kudirat Kekereekun, who has been confirmed as Chief Justice of Nigeria. And then to one of the juiciest stories of the day, to the top of This Day, we can see that we have news of an imminent cabinet reshuffle from President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, which is a story that The Punch also leads with. They talk about this looming reshuffle reshuffle of the president's cabinet. Its headline, the Punch's headline, says that the president demands the scorecards of 46 of his ministers as the lobbying begins. Now, as you know, many Nigerian ministers are currently in New York for UNGA, many of whom we have spoke to, and essentially many of whom may be out of a job while they are, here doing their work of their ministries in New York City. And funnily enough, if we look at the front page of The Guardian goes a step further by picturing the ministers, chief of staff, who may be scrapped by position or maybe even had their ministries itself scrapped. You've got better ado there. It is rumored that her entire ministry could go. But you do have very notable figures on the front page of The Guardian whose jobs are seemingly on some form of a metaphorical chopping board. I mean, we have also, as I said, been speaking to ministers here, and while we haven't been able to get any type of confirmation, it does seem as though when you're looking at specific ministries, there are some that may be a little more vulnerable than others. So it will be interesting to see what the fate of the Minister of Youth will be, for example, what the fate of our creative industries ministry will look like, and many others along that theme. Of course, the Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment, she's actually pictured on the front page of The Guardian. So again, very, very interesting to see what the outcome will be. It's unlikely that even though news of this reshuffling has hit already, it's unlikely that perhaps the jobs the job losses or the reshuffle will be announced before the return of these ministers back to Nigeria. It might even be closer to next month, but we will, as ever, be keeping our eyes and ears open. Let's look at the New Telegraph now. The front cover of the New Telegraph looks at how the price of petrol at the pump, and essentially it reaffirms another story that we had seen on the front page of This Day that says that the federal government will not intervene in this pricing controversy between the NNPCL and the Dangote refinery. And then lastly, in terms of our Nigerian papers, if you take a look at the front page of the Daily Trust is focusing its front page on another byproduct of economic hardship. Its headline says civil servants go to work twice a week. And naturally, this is not a hybrid situation. This is not, one of the lasting, lingering effects of COVID where people have a hybrid working situation. Sometimes they work from home, sometimes they work from the office. This is a direct byproduct of the economic hardship we are hearing and seeing. And even in this article, people being quoted saying that even feeding, being able to afford food when they are at home or elsewhere is difficult. And that has contributed to what we're seeing as civil servants not being able to afford to go to work. Let's move on now to the front page of the Daily Graphic of Ghana, and it has the president of Ghana, Nana Akufo-Addo, who's on the front page, of course, and it features his remarks during the general debate. And he, of course, like we've already mentioned, is also talking about seats, permanent seats on the UN Security Council. He says that it needs a general overhaul, the Security Council, and he also says that it's no longer fit for purpose and it doesn't address global challenges. So very, very strong words coming from the Ghanaian president. And lastly, let's take a look at some papers out of the United Kingdom. If we take a look at the Eye now, the front page of the Eye is focused again on its issue with Israel. And its headline says that the UK has told Netanyahu to step back from the brink as Israel prepares for a ground invasion in Lebanon. But it may well be time, as I said earlier, for the United Kingdom to reassess whether or not it's going to continue its arms selling to Israel, just in order to put its money where its mouth is when it comes to talking to this country, but also making them feel that you are serious about pulling them away from the brink of war. And then lastly, the Times UK talks about how the UK is trying to avoid and solve its prison population problem. Essentially, inmates could now win points for shorter prison sentences. That's something that's currently being done in the United States state of Texas. And what you have is the UK Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, planning to visit Texas in order to get a better insight into how she can implement this type of policy in prisons in the United Kingdom, which would of course replicate, she hopes, the success that it's already been enjoying in Texas, which is looking at how it can cut prison population and also cut recidivism rates. Recidivism is a reoffending, essentially, so it will be very interesting to see whether or not this is something that will be institutionalized and implemented in the United Kingdom for the time being.
Femi, for bringing us the newspaper review. It has been so good to just talk about some of the impending cabinet reshuffle by this administration. We've been trying to find out when will this happen since from the beginning of this year, but hopefully we'll see more concrete action on that in the next few days.